Thank you very much for the extraordinary long notice that you've given me to do this. Look, let's start off with some statistics. Asia accounted for 28% of EU goods exports in 2024. That was compared with 33% for non-EU European countries and 21% for the US. So within Asia, major EU export markets for goods include China, that's about 8.3%, Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore, Taiwan. And the EU has already got a number of free trade agreements in force with Asian countries. These include Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam. And of course, others are being negotiated with India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Now, earlier in the year, there had been suggestions that President Trump's policies might mean more cooperation between the EU and China. But those relations have obviously come under strain. And at the meeting between the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, I think she told the Chinese president that EU-China relations were at an inflection point. So there are real tensions over trade and China's support for Russia, trade tensions about the imbalance in trade between EU and China, the large surplus that China has. China's export controls on critical minerals is another area that the EU is concerned about. EU tariffs on electric vehicles from China is something that they're concerned about. And there's a sharp increase in the number of EU trade defense measures against Chinese imports. So that relationship really doesn't seem to be progressing in the way that it otherwise might have done. We've also, of course, got the EU trade relations with India. And goodness knows, I think they started the negotiation on the bilateral FTA 3 years ago now in 2022. But actually, they originally started back in 2007. They were paused in 2014. And again, earlier this year, Ursula von der Leyen and Prime Minister Modi said they hope that the FTA could be concluded by the end of this year. So we've got a whole series of things in the mix. Now, in the opening, you talked about Trump tariffs and India. Hey, let's get into that. I'm going to leave the experts to get on with that. One other thing I would just throw into the mix at the beginning, though, perhaps, is that the EU is looking at much closer links with the CPTPP. And I think that is an area that it'd be very interesting if some of our experts could just provide a little bit more information on, because that could be significant, very significant in my view. That's my opener, Humphrey. Short and sweet, but there you go. Well, look, can I just say this is one of the forums that I've most enjoyed. And I think it's probably because I was a Shadow Secretary of State for international trade, but particularly because I was also Shadow Secretary for the environment and climate change and energy. And so it was really great to have AJ's comments there as well, which I think are really important. But let me try and sort of recap over the past 50 or so minutes and pick up about what Bob was saying. Okay, he set out that he thought a rocky road ahead. He spoke about the EU-China summit this year, identified certain sectors, digital and healthcare, but said, look, headway was being made. But he really honed in on this: dialogue is not enough. We need a legal framework. We need regulatory alignment. If you're going to to be serious about an FTA, regulatory alignment is really important. Understanding what you allow into your country from theirs and vice versa. If you don't have that regulatory alignment, it becomes much more difficult. Look at what the UK has experienced with the EU after Brexit, the chaos at the beginning across the channel, because we now had to put in place all the checks and balances, even though we knew that actually we had regulatory alignment, but we hadn't agreed upon it. Now, he said the EU now have a framework agreement with the US, and here he's sort of focused on the big stomping boot that has come into this debate since you announced it in the first place. That framework agreement with the US, and he said, look, that could just completely scupper closer EU links with China in terms of trade talks. And he focused, as I mentioned at the beginning, about critical minerals. You know, let's face it, China has 60% of the critical minerals of the world. And what, Bob, I think you were suggesting was that the EU and the US were going to form some sort of an alliance that could take China on in terms of critical minerals. That's an interesting concept, but I don't know how quite they go about doing it, because China has got the majority of the market here. But again, it certainly is a battle that is going to be played out for the sort of security issues that we talked about at the end of the dialogue. But he also spoke about steel and aluminium cooperation being ring-fenced, standards and technical standards between the US and the EU, again, trying to sort of forestall those EU-China relations. But, you know, I think it raises a really interesting question. If Bob's right, and he may well be on this, that is a closer relationship between the US and the EU, really to corner, isolate China, then the question's this: if the US is a waning power and China is a rising power, is it smart to tether yourself to the one that's on the wane? And I just throw that out there because, you know, these are the decisions that the European Commission are really going to have to take that will determine the future direction. He spoke about Vietnam after Trump tariffs, sending more goods to the EU, and again, the sort of problem of trade diversion. Really good to be talking about trade diversion. And Humphrey, you asked about the CPTPP and the EU. And of course, Darius raised this as a central plank in which there could be greater Asian cooperation with the EU. I think he thought that was a very positive way in which there could be further cooperation. And he made the absolutely spot on point that together, the CPTPP and the EU account for 30% of global GDP. Now, what we know is that Commissioner Malmström in the EU is actually really keen on doing that deal with the CPTPP. I don't think others in the Commission are, and given AJ's sort of direct line into a few people in Brussels, it'd be very interesting to know what he thinks on that score. Of course, then talked about Russian oil and India. And I think I'm right in saying that it was originally tomorrow that the 50% was due to come into force, the 27th of August. That is, unless it's been postponed yet again, like all the other threats of tariffs have been. I don't know if we're going to get any last minute dispensations there. Of course, pharmaceuticals and electronics, including Apple, have been cut out of that 50%. They're excluded from that extra tariff. But I think it's interesting because AJ then talked about the importance of this as the US saw it, as being about the Ukraine war and Russia, and India supporting Russia's aggression in the Ukraine. And if you look at, I think the stats on oil, in 2021, India's oil imports from Russia were 3%. In 2024, they were between 35 and 40%. And of course, all of that is not being consumed in India. It's being refined and exported out. But it seems to me that what people need to be saying a lot more loudly and clearly in American ears is, yeah, but where are they selling it to? Actually, by and large, a lot of that is coming back into the European Union. You know, we talk about these sanctions, but we're not actually implementing them because we are the source, or we are the consumer for the diversion that is going on. So I think there, you know, hey, it's politics and it's trade and it's hypocrisy. But I do think we need to look a lot more closely at that. I mean, look at what Germany's been doing in terms of Russian gas. But AJ, I can't tell you how happy I was when you started talking about most favored nation status and that as a concept, and how all these tariffs are a complete violation of the WTO rules, the global order, how, you know, having set different tariffs for different countries for completely arbitrary and different reasons. And I think you used the phrase that what Trump has done is he has taken the initial trade war against China and turned it into a sort of global trade war. And it really has cut up against the whole of the understanding that we had about world trade and what was right and how, all the issues around diversion that flow from that. You know, I suppose it's the first time I've ever been forced to think, AJ, of Donald Trump as being likened to Lord Shiva, the destroyer who then creates a new order out of it. But hey, it may well happen. And again, thrilled that you talked about the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is putting in place. Now, I've long had my issues about CBAM because it seems to me that it's the right thing to do to try and make sure that you move forward environmentally as you outlined. But you do cause these precisely the problems that you identified. And it seems to me that the only way you can justify CBAM and say it's not actually only an environmental, but it's also a protectionist measure, is if you are then using the proceeds of CBAM to enable the countries who are locked into the old fossil fuel technologies, the black steel that you talked of, quite rightly, against the green steel. If you're enabling those countries to leapfrog technologies and to actually adopt renewable technologies and enable them to produce in the same way. So it's something that, in my view, should not be used, as I think many in the EU are doing, as a surreptitious, conveniently green trade barrier, but actually as a way of incentivizing other countries to make the new transition that we want to see. Look, there's so much else we could have talked about. I know we've run out of time. Humphrey, really enjoyed it. One further thing I want to add in, and that is trade gravity. It is important. What do we mean by trade gravity? we do most business with our closest neighbors. It's a fact of life. It's a fact of trade life. And we have to take that into the mix as well. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the session. Thank you to our speakers.